History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I'm honored to be joined by Deepa Anappara, author of The Last of Earth. Deepa, hi.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Colin.
Well, I want to start where I often like to start, and that's with the history. If you could tell us a little bit of the historical context for this novel to help people understand where and when this takes place.
The Last of Earth is a historical novel. It's set in mid-19th century Tibet, which at that time was known as the Forbidden Kingdom because Westerners were not allowed to travel into Tibet. But Indians who are on the border with Tibet could travel into the region for trade or pilgrimage because a number of sites that are quite sacred in Hinduism are located in Tibet. So at that time, India was being ruled by the British, and the British had a very specific interest in cartography. For them, map making was a way of extending colonialism and extending control over the rest of the world. So they were interested in Tibet because they were engaged in a sort of Cold War with the Russian Empire, which was known as the Great Game at that time. And they thought that Russians could attack India through Tibet. So they wanted control of Tibet, but they could not even go into the region. So what they did was to train Indians in very basic techniques of cartography so that Indians could go into Tibet and bring back information about the terrain, about the geography, that then they would incorporate into maps. So they trained Indians, this is a true story. The British trained Indians to act as spies in Tibet. So my novel is based on those true stories. It tells one narrative is about an Indian who is taking a white man who is in disguise into Tibet for purposes of exploration. And the other narrative is told from the voice of a woman named Catherine, a female explorer who is also interested in traveling through Tibet and visiting the Potala Palace. So it's a novel that tells stories that are typically not seen in adventure or historical fiction. And it's a book that explores the motives for cartography and exploration itself.
It sounds like such a rich period of history, especially for the imagination, just trying to imagine all the possible stories. What first kind of caught your attention and inspired you to write a novel about this time and place?
So after I moved to the UK, I'm originally from India, and I moved to the UK in around 2009 or 2008, perhaps, I've forgotten now. But whenever it was, I visited a secondhand bookstore in London, and they had a section for South Asia. And one of the books I found was this account by someone who was an explorer who had traveled to Tibet in the 19th century. And on the very first page, you could see his photograph flanked by two of his manservants, as he called them, who were two Indians. And it was very clear from the first pages that he could not have gone into Tibet without the help of these Indians because they knew the terrain well. They could help him deal with the hostility of the landscape and they could advise him about storms, the weather, or bandits. But at the same time, he talks about whipping them because they were, in his opinion, they were uncivilized, which was a very typical British view at that time. And so he talks about how it's necessary to give them a good whipping to make them understand their role and um, what the job requires of them. And so I thought that was such an interesting dynamic that here was a white man who was so dependent on these two brown men for his survival, but at the same time did not see them as equals. And I was also interested in the Indians who were undertaking these missions, which were very dangerous, and what was their motivation for doing so, and how did they feel about themselves when you have this very dehumanizing relationship with your master, so to speak. So I think those were the original questions, and starting from there, when I started researching about travel to Tibet in the 19th century, I came across a number of accounts about the British training Indians, making them use their bodies as surveying instruments. So they were taught to walk so that their each pace So you would place your foot forward at exactly 33.5 inches. And so you walked every mile covering, say in 2000 paces, you covered a mile, or, I'm getting my numbers wrong, but there were some calculations. I have the correct calculations in my novel. And so they were taught to walk in that very specific way. And so they would use their bodies to conduct these measurements and chart very rudimentary basic survey maps that they would put together later. So I was interested in what it would do to the sense of self to be using your body, and in many ways to be betraying Tibetans who in culture and their faith are much closer to Indians than the British rulers. So I thought there were a lot of stories that I could examine, based on these facts. And it was also during my research that I found out that there were many women who traveled to Tibet at that time. Not many, but a handful. And this was a time when women were wearing corsets and their clothes were very restrictive. And the very idea that they could also think about climbing very high altitudes, I thought it was, an interesting story for any writer.
Well, you raise a lot of really important issues and themes, and I want to ask you more about them. But before I do, let's get into those characters a little bit more. You said you wanted to know, well, what was it like for them? So in this novel, you have Balram and Catherine. Can you give us a little bit more about who they are and how you developed their characters for this story?
Balram is a school teacher. He works for a British-run school. He knows mathematics quite well, and this would come in handy for the time when the British decided to recruit him for their explorations of Tibet. So he lives quite close to Tibet in a border town, and they share many cultural practices, religious beliefs, as well as trade with Tibetans. So he's very familiar with Tibetans. He can speak the language, and he is recruited to take a British explorer who is in disguise into Tibet. So as foreigners are not allowed into Tibet, it's a very risky, dangerous mission. There's the possibility that they could be killed if they're caught. But despite that, Balram agrees to take this explorer into Tibet for his own reasons, as will become clear in the course of the novel. So that is one story, and really we're looking at Balram's motivations for taking this man he calls the captain into Tibet, and what is it doing to his own sense of self and identity uh, to be serving a white man at all times. The other point of view is of Catherine, who is a 50-year-old explorer. She has traveled into Tibet twice before, and each time she has failed to see the Potala Palace, which is her ambition and her final goal. And so this is her third attempt to reach the Potala Palace. So her narrative really looks at what does it mean for a woman to travel by herself with the help of maybe an aide or a guide in the 19th century, and in this very hostile landscape. So yeah, it's looking at these two points of view that we don't typically see, in accounts of that time or in novels about exploration.
So I love hiking in the American West. I earlier this year I went to um, it's in Mount, I can't even remember. It's the tallest mountain in the lower 48 states. It's in California. And about 10 years ago now, I did the Pacific Crest Trail all through California and Oregon. I'm curious, just from a recreational standpoint, what is the landscape like there in Tibet? Can you go and hike these regions? Have you been there yourself?
I did go to Tibet. I have to say upfront that you can't travel independently in Tibet. So you can't just take a backpack and decide, I'm going to climb, say Everest. Part of Everest actually can be accessed through Tibet. So you can see the one of the faces of Everest. There is a base camp even in Tibet, and it tends to be one of the places that tour operators typically take you to. So you can only travel through Tibet as part of a tour, but you can set up a private tour with this particular or any of the tour operators, and you can tell them you want to hike or climb a particular mountain, and they can help you do that. It's a very tedious process involving securing a number of permits. So typically, most people go where all the tourists are going. Part of the tour is through um, this trek, which the Tibetans call the Kora, which is which is circling Mount Kailas, one of the tallest mountains. It's not part of the Himalayan range, but it's also a pilgrimage for Tibetan Buddhists and for Hindus. And that trek takes you through a pass, which is at its highest point, I think it's around 18,400 feet. So I did do that trek. I think it's the altitude that is the biggest problem, not the trek itself, not the terrain itself, because the air is quite thin, and it's you do feel that lack of oxygen. Each step feels like there's like iron tied to your feet. I don't know if you've experienced that.
Well, I remember now it's Mount Whitney, which is about 14,000 feet. So that's the
That's
highest I
high.
can
Yeah.
say I've been.
Okay.
But I envy you. I would love to make that trip sometime.
I yeah, I don't trek at all. So it was actually my very first trek, and it was
Okay.
climbing 18,000 feet. So everyone thought I was mad. They did not think I was going to make it. But nothing can come
Did you
between.
have the novel in mind?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually went there because it was shut for most of the pandemic, Tibet and China. And even post-pandemic, Tibet was not open. So they only opened in 2023. And, I went in the first few months because I wasn't sure what would happen afterwards if China would close travel into Tibet again. So I did this, but by that time I had a full first draft, and which was really helpful actually, because I knew exactly what I needed to find out. I had a list of questions that I knew I had to answer. And, for I think there's a reason why there are so many books about grief and finding yourself through trekking and hiking and walking. There's a whole genre in nonfiction. Like you mentioned PCT, and Cheryl Strayed has written wild about that. And she's also talking about coming to terms with her mother's death on that trek. And I think there is definitely something in that landscape which encourages you not only to commune with the natural world but also reflect on your life. And because it's such a sacred place for a number of for Indians, for Hindus, for Buddhists, and for most Tibetans, and you see them on that trail, and how many of them do this trail is by prostrating at every step. So they go down, on all fours, they touch their foreground to the earth, then they get up, and then they do that again. And to do that at 18,000 feet, and to do that entire trek, if you're walking, it takes you 3 days. But when you do that, it's 3 weeks. And so for me, just seeing that level of faith, and they're not just praying for themselves, they're praying for the whole world, because that's how Buddhists typically pray. It was an incredibly moving experience. And I'm from India, so I've seen, we have our own religious festivals. So I should be immune to it, but I felt very moved by what I saw in Tibet, especially during that trek.
Well, it's really such a testament for the work you do, for the work historical novelists do in getting down into the weeds of the topics that they're writing about. So that's awesome that you did that and experienced that and are able to share some of those experiences on the page for readers. I want to back up and go talk a little bit about imperialism here. Obviously, your novel deals with issues of imperialism in the 19th century. You talked about the great game between Russia and the British Empire, but you explore those issues through the microcosm of these characters and what they experienced. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you approach that theme and what lessons there are for readers today, especially as we look at the continued legacy of that imperialism, and and how it even finds its way into your own work with your essays, letters to writers of color. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
It's a great question, but so complex. I could spend weeks talking about this because
Sure.
it's a pet subject. But I always say this is a book, The Last of Earth is a novel that I probably would not have written if I had continued living on in India. When you're in India, you don't really think about race. You're thinking about your government, the inefficiencies, and the politicians that you voted into power. So you're very much dealing with basic day-to-day questions. But after I moved to the UK, I was really shocked by the extent to which there's an ignorance about their colonial past. It's not taught in schools as much. It's not something that's discussed. And, you have people who are still quite ignorant and will say something like, we gave you the railways and you should be grateful for the railways. And so there's no understanding of what was not just the economic cost of colonialism. The reason this country is rich today is because they looted countries like India in the past. There's a lack of understanding of that, but also there's a lack of understanding of the extent to which it can fracture a country's identity, fracture the identity of people and their sense of self. I would say many of the problems that we see to this day in India and many other countries that were colonized by nations like Britain, you can trace it back to imperialism. So the very fact that, for instance, the English drew maps without even visiting India. So some of those maps, which cut across, divided in the Indian subcontinent into India and Pakistan, they were drawn by someone who had never visited India. So that person is sitting somewhere and looking at this very flattened representation of the continent, and then is just drawing a line because they think this is a good way to divide two countries, completely ignoring the kind of relationships that exist between people. So the map is essentially something that's man-made, that doesn't take into consideration, the relationships that are there, the coexistence of cultures and religions and peoples over centuries. So, and those maps are so, they've resulted in such conflict that to this day we see that India and Pakistan, for instance, they still consider each other enemies. And around the world, you can see that the maps that were drawn by the British are still a huge source of conflict. So that is one very tangible aspect of what imperialism has done, which we can see to this day, and about which there is not much discussion. But the other aspect is that there is a sense of superiority, which is associated with colonialism, the idea that, as a white person, you know better. And in some ways, you can see that in India in the way that Indians still prize white skin. You still have, at a very basic level, you see that there are fairness creams in the market because our brown skin is seen as a disadvantage. And so on a day-to-day basis, you're trying to, essentially bleach your skin so that you look white, because that is seen as something um, that is that is not only coveted, but which is seen as an advantage. But on the other hand, there's also, even in countries like the UK, there is a sense that they are, for many people, there is a sense that, you're superior to people uh, from Asia or from the African continent. And you see that in how they behave with you, or in the kind of racism that still exists, in the kind of rhetoric that politicians consistently put out, which, especially in recent times, it's been quite difficult to live here as somebody who immigrated to this country because of the kind of language that's used to describe, someone whose skin is not white. So in many ways, there has not been a reckoning about colonialism, and that idea of exceptionalism is coming from that failure to acknowledge these big errors which are committed, not just errors, but errors is too minor a word for it, but that refusal to actually look at what did those actions mean and what did it mean to, what does it still mean to people living in colonized countries. I would say that's the root cause of many of these problems in Britain, especially, leading to um, these political parties that essentially are, are very populist and far right, and um, they seem to be getting through to people in a way that they shouldn't. And I think part of the reason is that there has been that failure to acknowledge how so much of the wealth in this country was accumulated through, not just thievery, but also through murders and through deaths and massacres. So I do wish that discussion would happen. Sorry, very long answer.
No, no, I'm thank you for talking about those issues. And of course, yeah, we definitely don't have enough time to cover everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's just such a lack of understanding for why things are the way they are. And everything you're talking about in the UK is front and center here in the United States as far as rhetoric and people just not connecting the dots. I just your novel, I think, is so valuable for people who maybe aren't ready to confront those things. You can at least begin to understand them and relate to them through the character development in your novel. And really helps open that discussion and broaden understanding. So yeah, thank you so much for talking about those issues and sharing them through this historical novel. Let's. I actually want to talk a little bit about craft. This novel is a polyphonic novel, a term I actually have to admit I wasn't familiar with. So, can you talk a little bit about what that is and how the challenges of crafting a novel in that way?
So that is not the term I used as well, but there are other people who write your blurbs. So polyphonic especially means multivocal, so more than one voice. And in that, I guess this is a novel I'm trying to bring together different voices about, what was happening during the 19th century because of colonialism. And it is so for me, typically when you look at a historical archive, say for a country like India or any country that was colonized by the British or the Dutch or the French, what we find is that the historical record is written by, the people who ran the empire. And so they're not interested in putting in the points of view or the perspectives of, say, an Indian. What we essentially get is their perspective. So many times, for instance, when Indians would rise up against the British, especially in the 19th century, the way in which they would be described would make the Indians sound like savages, like people who didn't understand what was good for them. So you have to read these records and read in between the lines to see what is the Indian perspective here, really. So they are only calling Indians savages consistently. How does the Indian actually see himself or herself? And you have to find a way to glean that from these records. So I think for me, that was the biggest challenge, is to look at these historical records which were written by the British and try and understand and construct that Indian consciousness from those records. So I think what I've tried to do in my novel is to bring out those voices which you don't typically find in, any of the historical archives. And even the stories of women, it's not something that um, you see quite a lot. There were female explorers at that time. Some of them were published and some of them were quite popular. But equally, there would have been a gap between what their actual experience was and what they eventually published. And through Catherine's character, I was interested in looking at that gap between her experience and what she is putting out into the world. So I would say it is, through these voices, what the novel is really trying to do is to bring out those elements of history which you can't find in a history textbook. And one of the benefits of fiction is that I can bring in my imagination as well into play, whereas this would be much tougher if I would, I was a historian and I was writing a history textbook.
Well, certainly that's one of the best elements of historical fiction is being able to do that and cross those gaps that are left behind. So you are a journalist and you do short stories, essayist, but now you do historical novels. What are you working on now? What do you have planned next?
I have to clarify, I'm not a journalist anymore. I am an academic though. I do teach writing, creative writing. Um, and I am interested in both short fiction and in the personal essay. And, I hope to do more of that. I'm hoping, I don't really want to say that I'm working on another novel, but I think that's what's happening. It's too early for me to say what it is. I don't know what it is. I'm writing something. It's fiction.
Well, Deepa, congratulations on The Last of Earth. It's been very interesting to hear you talk about this novel, and I'm really looking forward. I haven't gotten a chance to read it yet, so I'm really looking forward to that. And thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an interesting conversation as well. Thank you.